I'm Courtney Lewis, Music Director of the Jacksonville Symphony. One of the things I'm looking forward to is playing more French music with our orchestra. This program contains two pieces by Robert Schumann, bookended by Gallic delights. We start with Gabriel Fauré's Pelléas et Mélisande. Maurice Maeterlinck's play by the same name cast a spell on many composers from Fauré to Debussy to Schoenberg. The story is a classic love triangle. Mélisande falls in love with Pelléas, the brother of her husband, and disaster ensues. Fauré wrote incidental music to the play in 1898. The suite drawn from the incidental music has a beautifully melancholic tinge, full of nostalgia. The prelude draws us into the world of Pelléas and Mélisande and their doomed attraction. The music moans with unfulfilled longing. The second movement, La Fileuse, depicts Mélisande sitting at a spinning wheel. I'm sure you'll recognize the Sicilienne. It begins with a very famous melody for flute against a harp and pizzicato accompaniment. This music accompanies Mélisande dropping her wedding ring into the fountain, symbolic of her decaying marriage. The last movement, the death of Mélisande, accompanies this horrible tragedy with great poise and dignity. Our next piece contains no emotional restraint whatsoever as we plunge into the volatile emotional world of Robert Schumann's Cello Concerto. Nowadays, we would probably identify Schumann as bipolar. His moods varied from absolute ecstasy and high to depths of depression. The Cello Concerto reflects this, but in many ways it's an understated work, just like Fauré's. All three movements follow without a break. The cello introduces the first movement with a long-breathed, wistful and fragile-sounding melody. The second movement seems to give us a little bit of relief, and the third movement builds to a climax that seems to be a catharsis, but there's something not entirely convincing about the C major that ends the piece. For these performances, we're joined by Nicholas Alstadt, a friend and a breathtaking cellist. Nicholas has French and German parents and lives in Berlin. We worked together in Boston a couple of years ago. And although he has a major European career, he hasn't played very much in the US. So this is a really major coup for Jacksonville and a highlight of the season. Schumann wrote in great bursts of enthusiasm for one genre. So for example, in 1840, he wrote hundreds of songs. In 1841, it was orchestral music, and he wrote the symphonies that we now refer to as numbers 1 and 4, the first movement of the piano concerto, and this piece, the Overture, Scherzo and Finale, which is basically a symphony without a slow movement. There's a wonderful entry from his diary in 1841 when he says, "Couldn't sleep, wrote the finale." This piece was composed in only 5 weeks from the beginning sketches to the completed orchestral score. Schumann described the work to his publisher as light and friendly, and the piece has a great sense of optimism after the heaviness of the Cello Concerto. The overture begins with a kind of heavy andante before moving into a very joyous allegro. The second movement has one tiny little rhythm, ba-bum bum ba-bum bum ba-bum bum ba-bum bum, which Schumann plays obsessively over and over again, and we can imagine his obsession as he worked with this rhythm. And there's also a sense of being so excited to get to the end that he almost can't wait, and the music gets faster and faster and faster until finally it ends with blazing C major chords. Claude Debussy loved the sea as a child, and between 1903 and 1905, he attempted to capture its essence in his orchestral masterpiece, La Mer. Debussy subtitled the piece Symphonic Sketches, and it's an interesting question of what exactly this piece is. It's not entirely abstract like Symphony No. X by Beethoven, but it's also certainly not program music like a Liszt tone poem or a Strauss piece. It's somewhere in between. Debussy really admired Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, and he saw what Beethoven does in that symphony as similar to what he was trying to do in La Mer. And of the Sixth, he said, "It succeeds simply because there's no attempt at direct imitation, but rather at capturing the invisible sentiments of nature." Debussy hated the term impressionism when applied to his music, but it's very hard for us to listen today to La Mer without seeing it as a kind of musical equivalent of the artwork of Monet or Cézanne. The piece is full of incredibly vivid orchestration, as if Debussy is inventing the sound of the modern orchestra, just as Monet and Cézanne ushered in the modern period in art with their brushstrokes. The first movement is entitled From Dawn to Noon on the Sea. It begins incredibly softly in the cellos and basses. We can hardly really hear what's going on, until gradually the music builds and builds, and we hear a theme in the cellos that sounds so like a wave, we can almost imagine seeing it right in front of us. Debussy wanted to make this point very clear, and he requested that the hokusai print of a wave be placed on the front cover of the full score of the piece. The second movement is called Play of the Waves. It's a scherzo, full of flashes of color, as if we're watching a shoal of fish changing direction very quickly. The third movement is called Dialogue of the Wind and the Waves, and as you would expect, this depicts a storm. The music builds to a very tempestuous climax and ends with great excitement.